Hello everyone on YouTube, it's Jordan here again, and in this video I'm going to be talking about my overall experience with Linux and why I think Linux is the ultimate operating system. My first experience with Linux was back in July 2020 when I was playing with a virtual machine. That virtual machine was running an obsolete version of Linux called Vinux. The project never took off really because it was meant as a Linux distro for the visually impaired based on Ubuntu 12.04 precise pangolin. That was the first version of Vinux I ever used. But Vinux is discontinued and will likely never ever resurface again. So, I eventually moved on to trying out a mainstream Linux distro. That distribution of Linux was Ubuntu. And I'm sure Ubuntu is many starting places for a lot of people. I mean, I'm pretty sure no one has ever heard of Linux without hearing about Ubuntu. Because the moment someone hears about Linux, Ubuntu is the first thing they hear about. If it's not Ubuntu, it'll be Linux Mint. So, I created an Ubuntu VM in the same program in which the Vinux VM is on, and played about with Ubuntu, and Ubuntu felt more up to date. It had the same Orca screen reader, it had exactly the same programs, but it just felt much more modern compared to Vinux. Granted, Ubuntu doesn't have a login sound. Ubuntu doesn't have a login sound anymore. It used to play when you start the Ubuntu system up after you've logged in. But most modern operating systems don't these days anyway. You're probably wondering what happened to Vinux then. Well, the last version of Vinux came out is based on Ubuntu 14.04. Now they were going to release a version based on Ubuntu 16.04 Xennial Xeris, but the problem with that is they were competing with Sonar and they had plans to merge with Sonar using Fedora as a basis. Now, this is what pinned Vinux down in my opinion. Red Hat probably turned around and said, no, we're not allowed. They probably turned around and said, we're not allowing people associated with Debian to create a software repository on a Red Hat based distro, is my guesses, and that's probably what ended the project. So Vinux will be permanently stuck on Ubuntu 14.04. But do the blind and visually impaired need a distro specifically designed for the visually impaired? And the short answer to that is no, they don't. Because mainstream Linux distributions are already starting to meet the needs of accessibility. Just look at Ubuntu. We didn't even need Vinux. If you look at the latest version of Ubuntu, actually lets you know that the system is ready so you can enable the screen reader. Canonical obviously cares about accessibility if they're going to put it in Linux. I'm pretty sure the developers of Vinux haven't actually played about with Ubuntu properly. So that's why they developed Vinux. But you can enable Orca on those distros, specifically with the Unity desktop. Well, most recent versions of Ubuntu start using the GNOME desktop, which means it's much easier to turn Orca on now. You just press Control, Windows and S. Well, I say Windows, I meant to say Super because that's what they call the Windows key in Linux. But then I came across Linux Mint, and that taught me all I needed to know about Linux, the basics of Linux, however. So I've been left wondering, Is Linux Mint better than Ubuntu? And the short answer to that is they're just as good as each other. It depends on your personal preference. Now, I do like Linux Mint, but I found myself coming back to Ubuntu time and time again, simply because Ubuntu started it all. If it wasn't for Ubuntu, I wouldn't be using Linux. Ubuntu is just one of those distros where you've got a friend, right, and he has an old Windows 7 machine, or he has a laptop that can't run Windows 10, and he asks his tech-savvy friend, can you recommend me a great Linux distribution to begin with? I reckon 90% of the time, they'll probably recommend you just use Ubuntu, because it's a great starting point. And then his second recommendation would be Linux Mint. Ubuntu has come a long way since it was released back in 2004. And the way Ubuntu is going, Ubuntu is going to become the ultimate Linux distribution. There's just so many things that Ubuntu is doing that is making it into other Linux distros, i.e. snaps, for instance. Snaps are a great way to get Linux applications because they don't rely on dependencies. The dependencies are in the package. I mean, good examples of snaps are the Chromium browser, there's even an Opera browser snap, and there's even a VLC snap. And snaps have made it to other Linux distros as well, including Fedora. Now, there is another distro I'd like to mention, which is an alternative to Linux, but I recommend you keep well away from that Linux distro. It's called Accessible Coconut. I've had it crash on me so many times. It is just so unstable. I wouldn't recommend it as a daily driver. It would be suitable to run in a VM, but it's just not stable enough to be a mainstream Linux distribution, which is why it doesn't get a place on Distro Watch. So if you want a really good easy to use Linux distribution, go for one of the top rated distros on Distro Watch. And if you look at those, you'll find Ubuntu there. Now I'm going to talk about what I love about Linux. And I'm sure you've all been waiting for that. So the main thing I love about Linux, and I'm pretty sure everyone loves this about Linux, is that Linux actually comes with a package manager. Want to get all your programs installed after installing a fresh new Linux distribution? You can totally do that. Want to install Firefox, Chromium, VLC, a MIDI sequencer all in one? You can totally do that just by using the command line. Or if you don't like using the command line, you can just use the Synaptic Package Manager if you're using a Debian-based system like I am. Or if you're using Fedora, then I suppose you can also use DNF Dragora. And the next thing I love about Linux, and I'm pretty sure everyone loves this about Linux, is how customizable it is. And with that, I mean you can change the look of the Linux distribution entirely. Don't like the GNOME desktop? Switch to a different desktop environment. Use Mate instead. Mate is the recommended desktop environment for the visually impaired. Don't like the default display manager? Oh, you can totally change that. Want to have a sound play on startup? Restore the old startup sound? You can totally do that. The next thing I love about Linux is how it controls updates. Now granted, Ubuntu is this, after you install Ubuntu for the first time, it will open the update manager straight away and ask you to install any updates. I usually go ahead and install these because it gives me a lot less thing to worry about. But once you've done your updates, you can just update whenever you want. And if you turn in
authentication Force quit applications. System dialog. Force quit applications. If an app doesn't respond for a while, set Chrome. Cap.
And if you turn on Canonical Live Patch, then you can update the kernel, install security updates without having to restart your system. And granted, most updates you install that are not kernel updates or any critical system updates will not require to restart your system. The next thing I love about Linux is what you just saw then with a Mac. It doesn't think that apps are crashing. Neither does Windows. Linux is perfectly stable, and if more and more businesses switch to Linux, then they won't have to worry about things. Which leads on to my next point, and that's security. All the software in your distributions or repositories has been vetted and tested and has been found to contain no malware whatsoever. It's simply because the repo or repository is watched 24/7. If a malicious app made it onto the repositories, it would be removed straight away. Also, you don't really need antivirus for Linux simply because of this. Granted, there are some apps you're going to want to download from the internet, such as, Skype, BlueStacks, Google Chrome, VMware Fusion, or is it Workstation on Linux? But other than that, everything's alright. And if you choose not to download Wine, which is highly frowned upon, I discourage any Linux user from installing Wine, then Linux is secure. Whereas if you install Wine, it would be less secure because it can now get all the Windows malware that can possibly roam around. And that's why I don't recommend you install Wine. The next thing I love about Linux, and this is really cool, especially if you're a musician, is the MIDI sequencer. I mean, when it comes to the default MIDI sound font, it sounds just about realistic. I mean, with Linux, you've got two sound fonts to pick. The default sound font that most distros come with, or the fluid sound font GM, which is more natural sounding. Now they sound a lot better than what you get on Windows and Mac. The Windows and Mac use the same synthesizer for playing MIDI. Linux doesn't. Linux likes to do things its own way, and I love an operating system that does things its own way. The next thing I love about Linux is that once you install it, it's yours to keep forever. Windows and Mac OS don't do that. Because granted, you have a license agreement to go through with Mac OS. Same with Windows. Mac OS still collects data about you, and so does Windows. Linux doesn't. But I'm not bothered about Windows collecting data anyway, because Microsoft do need to know about your PC in order to, they can improve their products and stuff. But Linux is just an install, set up, don't worry about things. And which leads to my next option is post-installation. All your important stuff is being done while you install Linux. There's no setup screen to go through, and I think all operating systems should have that. I don't like going through setup screens whenever I've installed an operating system. It's just relatively time consuming, and Apple and Microsoft can learn from this. Can't they just have it where you install Windows or Mac OS, the installation starts on your main drive. but you want to set, but you can set your profile up straight away that on the next reboot you'll be able to log in. That is what I call an operating system. Windows and Mac don't do that, but it's not really a problem on Windows, but it is on a Mac, since a Mac is basically a Unix system. And which leads me to my next point, switching from macOS to Linux. If you play about with a Mac terminal and use a lot of command line utilities, then those command line utilities are waiting for you right there on Linux. Make, bash, tongue twisters, ZSH, Emacs, provided you can install Emacs, of course, on a Mac, which is pretty easy to do. Homebrew, you've got LZ4, you've got all sorts to do. Heck, you can even install them on Windows if you fancy. Which leads to my next point, and that is Microsoft is starting to appreciate Linux. I mean, look at the Windows subsystem for Linux. That is coming on really nicely. And on the next version of Windows, we'll finally have support for Linux GUI apps running on Windows. But that isn't going to end Linux distributions. They'll still be available for those computers that can't run Windows 10. Because WSL is not going to replace a mainstream Linux distro. It just doesn't have the dependencies to run all the apps that you'll ever want to use. And granted, the majority of Linux apps already have Windows ports anyway, so it's pointless really installing those apps. Just install any apps that are not for Windows, like Pluma and Grandpa Archive Manager and gedit, which is the text editor. And the last point I want to make about Linux, it just works. Why, you may ask? It just does. No crashes, no blue screens, no spinning beach balls, no freezing when you're trying to work on your machine, no random Bluetooth pop-up, whatever you call it, Bluetooth setup assistant, no force quit applications, no two-factor authentication, no, try the new Safari or try the new Microsoft Edge. Linux doesn't throw their silly browser down your throat like Windows and Mac do. It just works. All it cares about is being an operating system, and all it cares about is just being itself. Because at the end of the day, the product is the product, not the customer. And it is my belief that Apple and Microsoft are not letting you personalize your operating system fully. Because when you buy a Mac or a Windows PC, it's usually the customer that's the product. Not the other way around. It's not the product that's the product. It's usually the customer that's the product. But with Linux, it's just the product, which is the product. But I don't think you can call Linux a product because it's a free operating system. And its open source nature allows it to be modified in a way that you can make your own distro if you wanted to. Heck, even Android is a Linux distro somewhat. And your Chromebook even runs Linux. Granted, Android is a heavily modified version of Linux, but it is still a Linux kernel. Anyway, Linux geezers out there, Linux fans, what do you like about Linux? Let me know in the comments. And I'd be interested to know what you love about Linux. And if there's anything I've missed, be sure to let me know in those comments. And here's a bonus thing that I love about Linux. 90% of hardware works with Linux. Granted, an AMD Radeon, a 7th gen of course, won't work pretty well with Linux. I mean, my AMD Radeon powered Lenovo IdeaPad 320 doesn't work properly with Linux, but everything else works.
Authentication. Force quit applications. System dialog. Force quit applications. If an app doesn't respond, Chrome.
Oh, and another bonus about Linux, it doesn't use Nuance Vocalizer. I really don't like Nuance Vocalizer, simply because it's just not good enough. There are better text-to-speech voices out there, eSpeak being one of them. Hopefully, eSpeak will be included in the next version of macOS, for those Macs that aren't powerful enough. But this video is about Linux, not about Mac. Anyway, this is Jordan signing off saying have a good day everyone.